Welcome to a news update from Paddle and Portage. Here at the Paddle and Portage team, we received noteworthy news on September 7th that a case of West Nile virus, mosquito-borne virus, was reported, documented, coming out of essentially a trip to the Boundary Waters. Joe, where do we start?
Well, let's start with our friend Heidi, who is the person who reached out to us and told us about the case of West Nile. And it's Heidi herself who has West Nile virus. She lives in Duluth, friend of the podcast, works for the Department of Natural Resources and Fisheries Biology and other things. We've talked with her and Dean Perrone, for example, in the past on the podcast. So Heidi reaches out on September 7th and says, Joe, I got sick. I got West Nile virus, and it came during my trip to the Boundary Waters, which was in late August, when there were a lot of mosquitoes.
We were out during that time. You on your own trip and me on my own trip. And right before that weather shifted, right before it started getting cold, it was thick. It was pretty thick.
Terrible.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And it's an interesting way that these cases unfold because, you get bit just like you get exposed to any virus. You don't know right away. You go about your life, maybe you start to feel crummy. And in this case, Heidi followed that progression, so much so that she ended up in the emergency room. And by then, things had gotten pretty severe from what you've reported.
That's right. In fact, I had a chance to talk with Heidi about the situation, the trip to the Boundary Waters, getting bit by all these mosquitoes, and then now being sick with West Nile virus. So let's hear some of my conversation with Heidi.
I definitely could not scrape myself off my bed for a couple days when I got back. I did paddle like super hard, so I thought maybe it was just fatigue. That was like a week after I got back. And I was like covered in hives head to toe. I thought, geez, Louise, I got a lot of mosquito bites. And there were bites like that would have been impossible for mosquitoes to do. So it's like, oh, these are hives. And I still didn't feel great, but I worked as best as I could last week. And then I just got fed up. I'm like, I don't want to sleep through the whole fall. So I went to urgent care last Sunday.
Tell me about that experience.
The doctor was like, okay, he did, like Lyme disease and all those tick-borne illnesses. And then he was like, I was like sweating profusely, but my fingertips were freezing. They couldn't get an oxygen reading on me. And when I stood up, there was like a Heidi imprint of sweat on the chair, but I didn't have a fever. And he's like, whoa, I can tell you're not okay. And he's like, let's do West Nile on that too. And so everything came back normal, except yesterday I heard that the West Nile was positive.
Wow. And this is at St. Luke's or something?
Yeah, this is in Duluth at St. Luke's. So that is like a week and a half after I got home.
Joe, you reached out to some top public health officials here in the state of Minnesota to try to get an understanding of what the lay of the land is like across the state in regards to these reports, positive diagnoses of this virus. How'd it go?
Well, the interesting thing that I learned right away is that there's an uptick in cases of West Nile in Minnesota happening right now, September 2025, statewide. And that includes now the Boundary Waters. And so it was very helpful to learn more about West Nile, what people who are going into the wilderness this September, this nice stretch of weather we have coming up here the week of September 8th, and people going in, what should we be thinking about if you're going on a canoe trip to the Boundary Waters with regard to West Nile virus? So let's hear from some officials at the Minnesota Department of Health.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Schiffman. I'm an epidemiologist supervisor at the Minnesota Department of Health. So West Nile is it's our most common mosquito-borne disease in Minnesota, and we see cases every year. But some years we see just hardly any cases, and some years we see a lot of cases, and it kind of runs through a cycle. Just that's how the disease sort of works in nature. And this year is one of those years where we're seeing a lot of activity. And last year was not one, but the year before was. So it's just kind of one of those up and down things. And, cases usually really start to pop up at the end of the summer in August and then into September. But sometimes, even into July, we can start to see things. And usually when we start to see things early, that's a good indicator that maybe it's going to be one of those busier years. And that's kind of what happened this year. Things started to roll in, and then they just kind of kept on rolling in, and they've just been coming at a steady pace for basically, the last month or so.
And is it due to precipitation or like the overall mosquito population? What is?
It's kind of a bunch of different factors, but a lot of it comes down to precipitation and heat. So both of those things kind of help mosquitoes, live and have a successful life cycle. And so we tend to see more mosquitoes in hotter summers because the mosquitoes like the warmer weather. The warmer weather also speeds up the cycles. So mosquitoes lay their eggs in water, and then depending on the species, they hang out there for a while. And when the weather is hotter, that whole cycle speeds up. So we often see just more and more mosquitoes in warm years. And then the precipitation is important too, because like I said, they need water. And if the precipitation, if we get like a giant rain event that really kind of washes everything out, that's not great for mosquitoes. But if we get lots of rain that's kind of evenly spaced in nice quantities, it keeps a nice water level around for mosquitoes, and it just kind of creates a more favorable sort of situation. And so every year, this virus is maintained in nature through mosquitoes and birds. So birds kind of have it all the time, and a lot of birds will kind of have it. Mosquitoes acquire it from biting birds, and then they pass it on to more birds, and you just kind of have this cycle that happens. And then what often happens is as the season kind of continues, that cycle moves faster, and you start to see some overflow, and mosquitoes that sometimes bite birds will also maybe now bite people. And then we see that overflow happening, and then that's when we see human cases.
This year, early up here in the Boundary Waters, we had like a lot of people, the outfitters in particular, were like, it's been a low bug year. And this was like in May, June timeframe, when people are kind of weary about bugs.
Yeah.
And then that narrative really seemed to change. And I was actually on a trip about the same time Heidi and this group was, and I had another two groups that I knew were out in the Ely and Gunflint side at that time, like that third week of August. And the bugs were as bad as I've ever seen. The mosquitoes were like unreal. And they were these like they were like not the kind of Boundary Waters traditional, like, oh my gosh, they'll carry away a car type thing, but these smaller looking ones. Is that like, are they more prone, the different species of mosquitoes? What can you say about that?
Yeah, so, I also was fortunate enough to spend some time up on the North Shore in June and was like, oh, the mosquitoes are not bad at all this year. It's great. And I think it was because it was kind of cool, early on. And then we got that warmer weather. And like I said, the warmer weather really helps. And then what also happens is, we have a lot of different kinds of mosquitoes here in Minnesota, even though to us, they kind of look a lot the same. We actually have about 50 different species in Minnesota, and they come out at different times and kind of have some different behaviors. And July is a month where a lot of our pest mosquitoes, the summer pest species, will really start to make their presence known. So it's possible that it was just a really good year kind of in that part of the state for some of those pest species. And, in regards to the size, some of them are smaller, some of them are bigger. But what we do see is in years where that cycle really speeds up and the mosquitoes spend less time in those developmental stages, sometimes you do see smaller mosquitoes just because they haven't spent as much time getting big and burly before they hatch out into being adults. So it's not unusual to hear people being like, and I saw them and they were really little this year. It's probably just because they were speeding through that cycle, trying to get out and about faster.
Okay. And is there a certain type of mosquito that is more likely to carry West Nile than another type?
There is. So the primary one that transmits it here in Minnesota is a mosquito called Culex tarsalis. And that is a mosquito that is actually much more common in the western part of the state. That's a mosquito that really prefers kind of more wide open agricultural habitat rather than that nice wooded habitat. And there are lots of mosquitoes that do prefer that wooded habitat, but traditionally our West Nile vectors really like that open area. So we see a lot more of those species out toward western Minnesota. So if you start, driving out toward Fargo or things like that, you're going to see a lot more of those mosquitoes. They still happen in the northeastern part of the state, but just in smaller numbers, basically.
And so if somebody is out in the boundary water September, like this week, it's looking like above freezing again, and it's not going to be knocking too many bugs out this week. So if somebody's out there and then they get home, what are some symptoms that they should be looking for?
Yeah, so, the good news with West Nile is that most people that get infected don't have any symptoms and don't even know they're sick. So the vast majority of cases go undetected. But some people are unlucky and they do start to get a few symptoms. And for most people that get symptoms, they're going to have probably a milder illness. They might, fever, fatigue, some aches, just feeling not super great for a few days. And then most of those people are going to recover. And we detect fewer of those not as sick people because, a lot of those people don't get sick enough to actually go to the doctor. I feel like it's one of those things where it's like, okay, if I'm not better in 2 days, I'm going to go, and you get better. And so you don't go in. But then there's a small proportion of those people that, kind of stay sick long enough to go to the doctor. And then for some of them, that disease can progress to being a bit more severe. So they might end up with meningitis or encephalitis. So some kind of severe illnesses as a result. But luckily for most people, it's relatively mild, and that those symptoms are going to crop up within about a week of being exposed. So it's a fairly quick turnaround time.
What might make somebody more likely to be sick?
Great question. So we tend to see older people get sicker, and people whose immune systems aren't working as well for whatever reason. So if you have an underlying health issue, maybe you take medication that kind of makes you a little more susceptible. Those are the people that tend to get sicker. But then every once in a while, there's someone who doesn't have some of those conditions, and they might end up sick as well. But for the most part, those more severely ill people fall into that older group, or people whose immune systems are not quite doing what we'd like them to do.
I saw a higher percentage of men on the...
Yeah, it's one of those things. We see it a lot with our vector-borne diseases. They just tend to be more common in men. I'm not quite sure what that is, if it has to do with exposures or if there's some kind of detection bias there that's happening. But typically every year we do see more cases in men than in women. But yeah, I don't have a good reason for that. Women are just as susceptible as men.
In terms of treatment, it's, from what I was reading on the page, it's more like rest and recovery is basically the best plan. But do you ever get rid of the virus?
It actually only sticks around for a pretty short time in your bloodstream, which is why it can make it sometimes a bit harder to diagnose, because some of the tests that are really good at detecting, like, oh, you have this virus right now in your system, usually by the time people are sick enough to seek care, the virus is already gone. It hangs around in your bloodstream, in your body for maybe 10 days or so, and then it's gone, or it's at levels that aren't really detectable. It does give you some protective immunity though. So we think that people really only get sick with West Nile once in your lifetime. So if you are one of those people that's lucky enough to get it and never even know you have it, you're probably protected, for the rest of your life. So it's not a virus that sticks around, but you do get some protective immunity from it after being infected.
Okay. And then in looking at the map, I see there haven't been any cases for Cook County residents. Doesn't mean that, somebody didn't go home after they got bit up in the boundary waters of the Gunflint, but, just a few, less than 10 in Lake and St. Louis counties. Why do you attribute that? I heard what you said about the ag side of things and just more prone by the Dakotas and so forth, and greater population in the metro, but whatever you could say about that.
Yeah, so I think it really does come a lot down to, the mosquitoes and where those mosquitoes are just much more commonly found. So, and just the landscape and things like that is just not as conducive to those particular species that are really good at kind of driving that cycle. And so we see that with vector-borne diseases a lot. We see cases in areas where the vectors are also present and fewer cases, where there aren't. So we see that with tick-borne disease, and the map kind of looks opposite, where we have a lot more cases in the wooded parts of the state than we do in the not wooded parts of the state. So I think a lot of it is that, there is that exposure thing, like you point out, people might, live somewhere where West Nile is common. And so when we do that investigation into things, we might, and they mention a trip and we think, well, they could have been exposed there, but it's much more likely they were exposed at home. So, there could be cases that have been missed over the years, but it's just generally less common in kind of that northeastern part of the state than it is in some other areas, for sure.
Most of the people who go to the Boundary Waters come from the Twin Cities, and there's only 5,000 people in all of Cook County that would be able to qualify to be on the map, like Cook County resident 0. But that doesn't mean that like people who are reporting it didn't get it in the Boundary Waters.
Yeah, and I think, one other thing that gives us kind of a good idea of what's going on with the virus, unfortunately, we don't have mosquito surveillance everywhere in the state. We have that in the 7-county metro area, but we don't really have it anywhere else. What we do have in other parts of the state are reports from, farm animals. So horses can also be susceptible to West Nile. I know there aren't a ton of big horse farms in Cook County and northeastern Minnesota either, but we haven't seen any animal cases. And we do sometimes get cases submitted from our wildlife partners. So maybe, a bird goes down or something and it gets brought in to wildlife rehab or gets submitted to the diagnostic lab at the U of M. And then, we try to track where those are from. And we just haven't seen a lot of that activity either from that part of the state. And then the final piece of that are blood donors. So every time you donate blood, your blood gets tested for various pathogens to make sure that, you don't make someone else sick by accident by giving them blood. And West Nile is one of the things that gets tested for. And we've also not ever had donors from that part of the state. And donors can be a great indicator because they're people that feel well enough to do all their regular things. And then they go and donate blood. And we've also not detected those from that part of the state. So I do think there is generally less risk, but, the way we measure it is based on county of residence. So it's certainly not perfect.
Okay. You mentioned birds, so they can get West Nile.
Yeah, so birds are kind of the main thing in that cycle in nature that sort of maintains it. So certain birds are especially susceptible. So back 20 years ago when West Nile first came, we saw a lot of people reported a lot of dead crows and things like that. That's a kind of bird that's really susceptible. And so sometimes raptors as well. So eagles or hawks or things will also get this virus and can get sick and unfortunately die from it. So they can be a good indicator of kind of what's happening in nature as well.
I just was talking with another person this morning, texting, and said I was going to be speaking with you all. And he and his wife were on a trip same time as Heidi, and he saw a dead raven right near a portage. And it was like a very, he didn't know about West Nile.
Yeah.
At the time up here. But I mean, what do you think? There's a possible link there?
It certainly could be. We get reports of dead birds. Sometimes it's something we did a lot of tracking of early on. So when West Nile was a new virus to us here in Minnesota in kind of the early 2000s, birds were an important kind of indicator of where things were being found. Because what we'd see was, a lot of dead birds being reported at the end of the summer, and it could be a good indicator of what was happening. Over the years, we've kind of gotten away from much of that because the virus is so widespread in Minnesota that we know that birds everywhere in Minnesota basically could have this virus. So it's not a great sentinel for us to say like, oh, there was a dead bird here, we need to be ready for human cases. It's more like, well, there was a dead bird. It very well could have died of West Nile, but there's just not a lot of we don't do as much testing and looking into those as we did for a while because they don't really help us predict where humans might get sick.
Is it unusual that this case has lasted this long?
So, it's hard to say. For most people, as I said, it is kind of a self-limited illness and they get better. But for some people, it does take longer. And if she was really worn down and fatigued from being out in the boundary waters and working pretty hard for a few days and, not getting the regular sleep and your life was different for that little bit of time, and her body could be a little run down, which could make it that something like this could maybe hit her harder than if she had gotten it when she was outside gardening and everything else in her life was totally the same, that kind of thing. So those factors can play a role.
Because there's this potential for a continued uptick in this warmer weather, not below freezing in the boundary waters this week ahead. I saw the recommendations for staying safe, like DEET and loose clothing and things. But I mean, if the Department of Health thinks for some reason that mosquitoes will stop biting people, you'll win a Nobel Prize or something.
Yes.
But like, it seems we're sort of at the mercy or the roll of the dice on if you're going to get it or not.
It's one of those things, unfortunately, with a lot of our, vector-borne things or things transmitted by ticks and mosquitoes. We can do all the right things, and sometimes you still, are unlucky enough to get sick. And so the best things you can do are those personal protection things, like wearing an effective repellent. Remembering to reapply it is a big one. The repellents, it's like sunscreen. You do need to reapply them to keep them working. They all work differently for different people, so making sure you're using one that is EPA registered. So a good repellent should have a little EPA registration number on the bottom, on the back of the label. And what that tells you is that the product is tested, it's been safe, it's going to work the way it says it works if you, use it according to the directions. And there are lots of different options out there. So just, being really smart about trying to choose something that is going to work is one of the best things that you can do. And then, knowing that this is the time of year where, you got to be extra careful with mosquitoes. The ones that were bothering you, if they were bad in June, probably wouldn't be the right kind to give you West Nile. But, this is the time of year where really focusing on that protection is going to have the most payoff in terms of, disease prevention.
Would you have any parting words just for people who are going on a trip to the boundary waters in the next week or two about just their mental state going on a trip, if it's safe, that type of thing?
Yeah, we always want people to get out and enjoy the outdoors. We have such a limited season. Sometimes it feels like in Minnesota when it's beautiful and it's great to get out. And so we want people to go out and enjoy things. We just want them to know that, there can be risks sometimes if you're going to be, out in the elements. It's good to remember to do your bug repellent and do all those kind of things. Wind is a great thing. If you happen to be out when it's windy, that'll help keep the mosquitoes away. But we want people to enjoy the end of the summer and the early fall weather, but just knowing that, it's a good idea to not forget your bug repellent.
It's helpful to get facts. It's helpful to get an understanding of what's happening. And of course, following all those procedures. It's great for the rest of us. We're going to be ready for those mosquitoes. But I'm really still wondering and a little bit worried. What's going on with Heidi?
Well, let's hear a little bit more of my conversation with her, how she's doing, some of the symptoms she was experiencing, and more of that conversation.
I didn't feel like my head was going to blow off my neck this morning, but I was like, whoa, my headache is worse behind my eyeball. My dog wouldn't leave my side, which is crazy. She could tell I didn't feel good. So I was like, I'm just going to go into the ER. So I drove myself over there and hung out
Jeez,
all
Heidi,
day.
you been at the ER today? Holy shit.
Yeah, all day. But I read almost an entire book.
Well, what'd they tell you? What's the status?
He did all this blood work and other testing, like heart testing, EKG. And everything came back good. Like the levels of some of my blood work were within normal range, and they were maybe a little bit different than a week ago. But basically, he said this is a viral infection that you just need to rest, eat healthy food.
Did they do like a scan of your brain or anything to see if it's swollen or?
No, I think because my headache was bad, but not like treacherous, and I don't have a fever.
Joe, you in fact heard directly from Heidi today before we sat down to record, just checking in to hear how she's holding up. What's the update?
Well, so she was in the emergency room Sunday, September 7th. We talked again Monday, September 8th, and she was still feeling under the weather. Tried to get up and have some lunch, even had some plans to meet a friend, and just that was it. Crashed afterward. Like, I'm done. I'm toast for the day. I'm taking a nap, and she's still feeling it.
I want to thank Heidi for reaching out to us to share this story, knowing that this is a helpful thing to get out to our listeners and to the greater public. Heidi here at the podcast, we're thinking of you. We're wishing you well and a fast and safe recovery. And thanks to the folks from Department of Health. And Joe, thank you for jumping on this story and getting word out to folks.
Sure. And if you're headed out, be safe, be mindful. That's all we can do.
Take care of yourself out there. See you on a portage.